I want to take a step back and look at Africa from a larger picture. When we think about the sheer size of Africa, you could take the entire United States, every country in Western Europe, every country in Eastern Europe, India, China, and Japan, and that basically equates to the size of Africa. So Africa is big. It's really big. And one of the reasons why I think we have a hard time grasping this is because we spend a lot of time looking at this map, the Mercator projection map, which makes areas near the equator, of which Africa is part of, look relatively small. And it makes areas that are closer to the poles, like for example, Russia up here, and Europe and Canada, and especially Greenland, look incredibly big. Greenland is actually 1/13 the size of Africa. But because we look at this Mercator projection map, we oftentimes have a distorted view of the size of Africa. So Africa is big. It's really big. Here is a more accurate Peters projection map showing the relative size of Africa compared to the other major continents. Now, the early history of Africa is hard for historians to analyze because they didn't keep written records. They didn't have formal systems of writing in the same way that developed, for example, in Egypt and Mesopotamia and China. Now, does that mean that Africans have no history? No, in fact, they had a very rich history. African history, however, is passed down through oral traditions and art. Each tribe or clan oftentimes had what's known as a griot. A griot is a storyteller, and that storyteller was responsible for learning the stories of their particular group's history and then passing that knowledge down to future generations. Now, lest you think, well, that means that somehow Africans were inferior because they weren't keeping written records, may I remind you that right now you're listening to an oral history rather than choosing to read written history. Obviously, one of the challenges with oral history is its accuracy. Much like a game of telephone, there's certainly some credibility questions when it comes to oral traditions. African tribal societies were extremely complex, extremely diverse. Lots of different languages are spoken on the African continent, and very complex, diverse societies. That's one of the reasons why it makes African history harder to study, just simply too complex and diverse to make generalizations, which is sort of the level that we're at in AP World History. How did geography impact trans-Saharan trade? So the Sahara Desert served as a huge geographic barrier during the early classical era, and that's going to really the amount of trade between those two regions as a result of this massive geographic barrier, the Sahara Desert. This is all going to change with the introduction of the domesticated camel. Towards the end of the classical age and the beginning of period 3, we have the introduction of the domesticated dromedary camel that was originally from the Arabian Peninsula. And this is going to lead to the growth of trans-Saharan trade. It's going to lead to the establishment of more centralized kingdoms in sub-Saharan Africa. So the camel was a critical change in period 2, kind of moving into period 3, and also innovations in camel saddles. Camels were an important pack animals. It was important to get as many goods on top of those animals as you possibly could hold. And so improvements in camel saddles was another major change and innovation that led to increased size and volume and efficiency of trade on the trans-Saharan route. So what types of goods were exchanged in the trans-Saharan trade network? One of the major continuities that then we could maybe identify with trans-Saharan trade was the types of goods that were being exchanged. And the reason was there's an incredible geographic diversity as we go from North Africa here to West Africa down here. And you can really see it on this physical map. And so in North Africa, they're going to have very different natural resources than they are down here in West Africa. So in North Africa, they do a lot of salt mining. There's natural occurring salt in the Sahara Desert. Whereas down here in sub-Saharan Africa and West Africa, there was really no salt to be had, but they did have a lot of gold that they could mine, an incredible amount of gold. And so, two of the major goods that were exchanged in trans-Saharan trade were gold and salt. There was also a significant slave trade, both that formed in the west coast of Africa and also on the east coast of Africa in the Indian Ocean region as well. Now, West Africans are going to trade gold to North Africans for salt and also to Arab merchants for other goods. You think, well, wait a second, that is a totally unfair trade, right? Gold is incredible because it's shiny, it's malleable, you can shape it very easily, and also it's relatively rare, although not so much in West Africa as we're going to find out. But the reality of it is salt is an incredibly valuable resource as well. Salt is essential for human life. You need a certain amount of salt in your diet in order to survive, especially if you're living at or near the equator, which West Africans were, and you sweat and perspire a lot, and so you lose a lot of salt in that process. It's also really critical for preserving food. Salt was essentially like refrigeration systems that we have today.
Okay, we've talked about silk roads, we've talked about sea roads, and now we need to talk about sand roads, namely the trans-Saharan trade routes. These routes link North Africa and the Mediterranean world with the interior of Africa, specifically West Africa, and because the environments of these places varied so widely, they produced different goods, and therefore created the incentive for trade. In North Africa, the folks mainly produced manufactured goods like cloth and glasswork and books. In Southwest Africa, they were agricultural and therefore produced grain crops and yams and cola nuts. Now, a major turning point in the history of the trans-Saharan trade routes was the introduction of the Arabian camel. Now, this happened centuries before the time period that we're considering in this video, but their effects were still in force. You see, camels could walk for up to 10 days without water, and that made it possible to transverse that vast stretch of desert between North Africa and West Africa. And as with the other trade routes we've looked at, the trans-Saharan trade routes also did its fair share of culture changing, specifically political culture changing. And between 500 and 1600, West African civilization really began to take shape. A notable example of this is the rise of the Kingdom of Mali. At its high point in the 14th century, Mali held a monopoly on the trade of horses and metals, and to generate revenue, they levied taxes on salt and copper. When all those things start to take place, it's not long before a social hierarchy forms. In Mali, the social hierarchy was stacked up pretty similarly in comparison with other civilizations. At the top sat the royalty, under them were the elite classes, under them were the merchants, under them were the military and religious folk, and under them were the peasants, and under all were the slaves.
Hey team, so you saw the reference to the trans-Saharan slave trade throughout this. We are going to get further into what this looked like when we compare this to the Atlantic slave trade, but just note now this is a very different system, this internal African slave trade, than the one that we'll look at later, the Atlantic slave trade, which is what we most often think about when we hear this term slave trade. This is a very different system though, so just note that in your notes at this point. We will come back to this later in the school year.